My name's Claire Merchant-Jones. I'm the strategic manager within the statutory SEND team. So I'm responsible for education, health and care plans across Somerset, both the assessments. So I like to describe it as the getting of and having of an education, health and care plan. So the assessment part and the maintaining and reviewing aspects. So I suppose in context, Somerset are now maintaining about 4,300 education, health and care plans. And as you'll know, that's a huge increase from, I think, the sort of 1,700 statements and education, health and care plans we had back in 2018. So I think it's a good context to work in because we've put a lot of effort in Somerset in improving our education, health and care process. I'll just let these people come in. Oh, I wonder if they feel like we've had a bit of an onslaught. Hello, new people who've just joined. We'll quickly start again if that's okay. Rachel has introduced us, and at the start just said we're going to do a quick presentation and then we're going to have some time for questions and answers. We just ask that the questions are around the annual review process rather than individual children and young people. It's not appropriate for us to answer questions in that respect today. I'm Claire Merchant-Jones. I'm Strategic Manager of the Statutory SEN team. Thank you very much for spending time with us today. I was just explaining we have about 4,300 children with education, health and care plans in Somerset, and we are responsible for making sure that there's an annual review held for those young people on a yearly basis. We've worked really hard on improving our approach to annual reviews, and I think nationally it's recognised that annual reviews are a bit of a poor relation, if you like, to assessment processes, and we've spent some time with Kat's help looking at improving the annual review process for everybody involved. So I'm here to represent the Statutory SEN team, and I'm really happy to answer any questions after Kat's finished her presentation around different aspects of the process. With all these things, it's a work in progress. We recognise that it's not perfect for everyone, and we're always looking to learn. So with that in mind, I'll hand you over to Kat.
Thank you. Yes, as Claire said, my name's Kat and I'm a Learning and Development Officer within the team. So a huge part of my role is all to do with training. But prior to doing this role, I was a primary school teacher working in different schools across London and Bristol. But originally I'm from Somerset, from Taunton. So it's great to be back working with the local authority. So I'm going to talk for 20 minutes, but in truth, I could talk for over an hour on the annual review process. So I've really tried to think, okay, which are the bits that are going to be most beneficial for you to hear about? So I'm going to look at what the Code of Practice says about annual reviews. I'm going to share with you some of Somerset's data. Claire's already touched on the point that we've got over 4,300 plans in circulation. I'm going to talk to you about each step of the annual review process so that you as families know what you should be expecting to be happening within the process. I'm going to talk a little bit more about what should be happening within the meeting itself, and then just finish off by talking about our decisions when we're amending plans, when we're making changes to EHC plans post-annual review, the timescales for that, as well as just a little bit about early annual reviews. But I'll talk for 20 minutes. I'm going to really be conscious about that timing so that there's enough time at the end for questions. So in terms of the legislation, and when we're talking about the legislation, we are using the Code of Practice. So it says plans should be used to actively monitor children and young people's progress towards outcomes and aspirations, and they must be reviewed by the local authority a minimum every 12 months, with the reviews focusing on the child or young person's progress towards achieving the outcomes and whether the outcomes and targets remain appropriate. Now, in September last year, I did training very similar to this, albeit in a lot more detail, to school settings, all about the annual review process. And when I shared this slide with them, I was really quite purposeful in pointing out that the Code of Practice is saying, although annual reviews must be reviewed, it's not saying that they need to be amended, that they need to be changed every 12 months. And that was a really important point to just to make sure schools are on the same page as us as a SEND team in terms of what their expectations should be. And I think it's really important to also share that with you today, so that you're going into the annual review process with the knowledge that it's not the case necessarily that every annual review is going to end in the decision to amend a plan, and that it's absolutely appropriate that a successful annual review might conclude with the decision that this plan can be maintained as it is. Because I know we have members of our SEND team who were former SENCOs, and they shared their experience that perhaps schools were not feeling that they were doing the annual review process properly or thoroughly enough if they weren't concluding that amendments needed to be made. And I hope that that is supportive in terms of you having that correct expectation, that you're not expecting necessarily amendments to be made each and every time, and therefore not feeling disappointed when you hear that the decision is to maintain. In saying that, though, don't get me wrong, if it's clear and there's the evidence to show that a plan needs to be amended post annual review, then we absolutely would make that decision, because obviously we want to be using annual reviews to support children and young people as best as possible. But I think it's just important to bear in mind what the Code of Practice is saying, and I will be talking, as I said, a lot more about the amendment process later on. The Code of Practice also is quite clear in saying that reviews must be undertaken in partnership with the child and families or the young person, and they must take account of their views, wishes and feelings. And again, when I shared this to schools, I was very clear that it should be both the families and the child or young person, not one or the other, which I think sometimes schools fall into that trap of just saying, oh, we've got one viewpoint, we don't need to get both. And also I sort of pointed out to schools that there are many ways that we can be accessing the viewpoint of our non-verbal children and young people. So we shouldn't just be not getting their viewpoint because they're not verbal. So Claire already touched upon that we've got over 4,300 plans. This data page is showing you the data for the last full academic year. So we know now that this number, 4,000 plans in circulation, is actually slightly higher. What this means in terms of the annual review process is, as a team, we're processing on average of 250 annual review meetings that are held every month. That might range from 10 in August, because obviously less of the process is happening in the school holidays, to 450 in November 2020. And there's reasons why that month is so high, which I'll explain later. We have ROs in our team, that stands for an assessment and reviewing officer. We have ROs specifically focusing on the annual review process, and they're working on average of about 80 to 100 annual reviews at any given time. In this academic year, there were over 3,000 annual review meetings held. And if we compare that to the previous 2 years, where we had much lower than 2,000 and around about 1,600 the year before that, that shows a huge improvement in the performance and the understanding of annual reviews. I'm going to talk a little bit more about phase transfers, but over 99% of phase transfers were completed within the deadline in the past 2 years. If we compare that to the 2018-19 academic year, that was under 30%. So that's a massive improvement. And for all other annual reviews, and just to be clear, when I say phase transfers, I'm talking about that transition between different stages of education. So from primary to secondary, for example, 61% of school settings sent us the report within 2 weeks, which is their statutory guidelines. And we were processing 43% of those within 4 weeks, which is our timescales. But there's a little bit more context to have with this statistic, which I'll talk again about in a moment. You can see, therefore, that we are making huge improvements as a team, but we are always committed to be further improving. And the training I led in September to school settings, and also the training today, where we're having that conversation with you as families, is really part of that journey that we are committed to improving upon. So in terms of what do we hear from parents about issues with the annual review process, and these points are reported nationally, but I think if possible today at the end of the session in the Q&A parts, we'd love to hear anything else that you might want to share with us so that we can be really reflecting on that as a team. So parents might be saying that they don't really feel they have enough notice of the meeting, that they don't get given any reports in advance so that they have that time to be able to properly read and consider what's in the information within that report before the meeting, which therefore leads to new information or surprises being sprung on families at the meeting itself, the feeling that their views might not be properly recorded. And then this annual review report is made by the school setting, that goes to the local authority, but then either nothing's done with it or parents not feeling that they're properly told about what the decision the local authority make. And I think based on our data that I've just shared with you, I think that final point could have been a reflection of Somerset a few years ago. I don't think I know that's not the case now due to our statistics that shows how much better we've got. But as I said, we are continuing to make improvements, and we are committed to those improvements. So this is the annual review process, and this diagram shows what should be happening at each step of the process. And I keep using very deliberately that word process, because the annual review is not just about the meeting. Here you can see it's a 5-step process, with the meeting being one aspect of that. I know I was guilty at times when I was a teacher of thinking that an annual review was just about the meeting. It's really not. There's a lot more to it. So I just want to spend a little bit of time just talking through those 5 steps and what should be happening, so that you are armed with that information in terms of what should I be expecting is going to happen when I'm involved in an annual review. So the Code of Practice gives us these timescales, and these are the timescales that we as a team are working towards in terms of our data performance. But 4 weeks before the meeting, no less than 4 weeks before the meeting, is when requests for information all about the child or young person from anybody that's been involved with them should be going out. And that should include going out to you so that we get your viewpoints and also the viewpoints of the child or young person themselves. It includes health and social care providers where relevant. And you might be thinking, oh, giving people, particularly healthcare providers, only 4 weeks notice, that's not a lot of time. And what schools often do to sort of counteract that is that they might provide their annual review schedule a whole year in advance so that they can offer people more notice. We as a team are giving school settings information about all the annual reviews that are coming up for that academic term at least 2 weeks before the start of the new term, so that this process can be really well scheduled. But the important point is this is the minimum timescale that the Code of Practice is stating. So then the second step is all about circulating that information, as well as giving those official invites to the meeting itself, to avoid those issues that parents are reporting in terms of not having time to properly digest what information is being provided about the child or young person. Then we have the meeting itself, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what exactly should be happening within that meeting in a moment. Typically that's going to be held and hosted at the school setting. Within 2 weeks of the meeting is now step 4. That's when the annual review host is going to be preparing and sending the reports about the annual review meeting, which is going to include all of those discussions that took place, any different viewpoints that were shared, and that's going to be sent to the local authority. And it must also include all of this information that was gathered from step 1, because we want to be seeing that, because it's not uncommon that people might contribute to the meeting in terms of providing information, but they can't actually attend themselves. So it's important that we see all that. And then 4 weeks after the meeting is when, us as the SEND team, will have looked at the annual review report. We'll have looked at all that additional information that came in step 1, and based on all of that information, we'll make a decision, and that decision will either be to maintain the plan as it is, so to keep it unchanged, to make amendments to it, or to cease the plan. And we need to do that within 4 weeks from the meeting. not within 2 weeks of receiving the report. So if I just take you back to the statistics, if we don't receive the annual review report until, say, 3.5 weeks after the meeting, we're still judged on that 4-week date post meeting. So that just helps to put that in a little bit more context. And again, just this slide, again, still showing you that diagram, is that generally it's an 8-week process. And as per the Code of Practice, steps 1 to 4, although it is the local authority's overall responsibility to ensure that the process is taking place, steps 1 to 4 is typically delegated to the school setting. So I hope that that helps you understand that if you're receiving an email, for example, saying, "Hi there, your child's annual review is going to be on Wednesday at 4, we hope to see you there," that process has not been properly followed, because it doesn't allow for that time beforehand to make sure that all that information is being gathered and shared. So within the meeting itself, again, this comes from the Code of Practice. So these are all the things that should be happening. So talking about progress made towards achieving outcomes, whether they remain appropriate, reviewing and setting new short-term targets, thinking about is the provision appropriate, conversations about the health and social care provision, talking about whether aspirations have changed, and also checking whether there's a request for a personal budget. We know that this third point here about short-term targets and setting new ones becomes a little bit problematic when, as you know, the expectation is not necessarily to be amending each and every time, and therefore you have old short-term targets remaining on a plan where we choose to maintain it. And when we discussed this with school settings, we said, yeah, we acknowledge that, and it might be going forward as and when we review the annual review paperwork and the plan paperwork itself, we might have short-term targets as an appendix rather than on the plan themselves to try to mitigate that. But I think what's important to remember is whether the decision is to maintain or not, all of those, or to amend or not, all of those conversations going on within that annual review meeting are so beneficial for the child and young person. And it's not just about the decision that the local authority makes. There's so much more benefit going on there. Just a few other points about the meeting. When we're talking about children under 5, there's very much the acknowledgement that going a full 12 months is too long between each annual review. So annual reviews might be happening more like every 6 months, albeit slightly on a more informal basis. And that does include your reception summer born who won't be turning 5 until the end of that year. Year 9 onwards reviews, they must have that focus on preparation for adulthood. And for looked after children, the annual review, where possible, should be sort of coinciding with the personal educational plan within their care plan. So it might be a bit of a mystery in terms of, okay, the meeting's been held and happened. The annual review report has been compiled, but then what happens to it? So to sort of put your mind at rest, when the annual review report comes to us as a SEND team, every single report is read and considered, and it's done through collaboration. It's not just one person making a decision, and it's through that collaboration and that looking at all the evidence that's provided is how the team makes that decision whether to maintain, amend, or cease. All of those that are decided to be amended gets allocated to an RO, an assessment and reviewing officer. And just on this slide, I can see there's also the mention of SAROs. They're senior assessment and reviewing officers. But the RO who's allocated all the amended plans, that then would lead to an initial phone call to talk you through the changes that are being proposed. So, and I'm very conscious of the time, I don't have much more to say, but I hope that it's been a little bit clearer, therefore, that the annual review is a process, it's a 5-step process, and that the process should be taking 8 weeks. And I've also talked about how there shouldn't be that expectation that plans should be amended each and every annual review. And there you can see from the Code of Practice, plans are not expected to be amended on a very frequent basis. However, we know that there are circumstances where there are reasons to amend plans. And so as Somerset, we've sort of created a criteria list in terms of which plans we want to prioritise in terms of making amendments. So we're making amendments to those plans where we can see that there's significant changes to special educational needs or to health and care, or to a change in circumstance, and we can see that there's that evidence to support that. Those plans where we can see there's evidence to support that a change of placement is necessary, and our phase transfers, which I've said are those that are transferring to a new stage of education. When we are amending plans, it becomes a little bit more complicated in that there's an additional 8 weeks that's allowed in terms of making those changes, because it needs to allow enough time for the new plan to be drafted, to have that consultation with schools if it's a phase transfer or a change of placement, for parents and families to be able to look at that plan and give their comments. So when it's an amendment, that process, that annual review process, is going to be slightly longer. But the Code of Practice is still saying that the annual review process needs to be finalised within 12 months of the last. So for that reason, when a school is going into the annual review process thinking we're not going to ask for amendments, it's absolutely appropriate to hold the annual review meeting 4 weeks shy of the 12-month anniversary, because that gives enough time. However, when you're going into an annual review process with the view that amendments are going to be requested, we're actually saying to settings that meeting needs to be scheduled more like 9 months from the last annual review process, so that it can allow for that additional time for the amendment to be made and all the consultations, etc., to happen. But just to add one other level of complication, when we're talking about phase transfers, the Code of Practice gives us these 2 deadlines in terms of making sure that whole process is finished, either March or end of March or middle of February, depending on which new setting the young person or child is moving to, so that it can therefore allow that transition time between the old and new setting to prepare for that child or young person. That's why when you saw our data, we had so many annual review meetings happening in November, and it's why our team right now are frantically working to meet this 15th of February deadline, because that's another timescale we're working towards. So that might mean your annual reviews for those particular years happen at a slightly different time to when you were expecting. Just to finish off, there are times when there's such a change to need that going 12 months or going even 3, 4, 5 months until the next annual review just wouldn't be appropriate. And so schools or families or any professional involved do have the power to request an early annual review, which means that the annual review is held much sooner. And we want to be seeing there's that significant change of needs, making the placement at risk. But when I trained schools on this, I said, actually, this isn't just a knee-jerk reaction. We are, as a local authority, looking to see that you have done things like sought wider professional involvement, or perhaps requested things like a multidisciplinary team meeting has happened beforehand, so that there are steps to sort of go through before that happens. I know I've talked a lot, and I just want to flag to you that I have been updating lots of the SEND pages on the local offer website, and there is a whole section on annual reviews. So if you feel that you want to have a little bit more information about it, then can I just flag you to that information there. But I think it's a good time now in order to give you enough time to have questions if we bring Claire back in, and just hear, as I said, any questions you might have, or any sort of feedback in terms of your viewpoint on the process, and that's why we're here, and we're really keen to hear from you.
Yeah, hi everybody. Should we take there's a couple questions